Hello, my name is Ware. I'm the director of a documentary called Skin Deep, The Battle Over Morgellons. And I'm here to talk to you today about Morgellons disease and why it's so important for Lyme disease activists, Lyme disease patients, and the Lyme disease community in general to know about Morgellons disease and to advocate for Morgellons disease. And the most important reason is that 6% of all chronic Lyme disease patients exhibit Morgellons disease symptoms. So statistically speaking, if you know 20 chronic Lyme disease patients, you know a Morgellons disease patient. And a lot of folks will ask me, because I've made other films that aren't documentaries, and I had been looking for a documentary film for a long time, a subject, and people ask me, well, what got you interested in Morgellons disease? And specifically, it was Under Our Skin, the documentary about chronic Lyme disease, that got me looking into this. But generally, the thing that intrigued me were the cycles of medical denialism that I'd seen in my own life and that I've seen in the news and in other medical documentaries. So for when I was a kid, we had an uncle named Uncle Ray, and he had an ulcer, and he would eat baby food at dinner, and we were like, that's really strange. Why doesn't he just eat normal food? And the ulcer was so bad that he couldn't have a regular diet. And so the treatment that they had recommended to him was Freudian psychoanalysis, because the thinking at the time was that ulcers were psychosomatic, they were psychogenic, they were caused by mental states that originally had been created by his mother, that when he was a boy, he would cry and she would give him candy. And so this reaction between stress and digestive juices was hardwired into his body. And so later in life, when he would get stressed, he would then get ulcers. And that was a pretty common belief. And that's what we were taught in high school. And later I found out that that was just a bunch of hooey, and that actually it was a bacterial infection that had never been treated, and that led to a lot of people getting gastritis and cancer and dying. But there was a doctor named Dr. Barry Marshall, who was a gastroenterologist from Perth, Australia, and he had discovered that there was a bacterial infection that were causing 85% of all ulcers, and so he published papers about it. And what that did was enlighten a few people, but mostly it just got him. It got the medical world angry at him and called him crazy, and they didn't believe his papers. And so what he had to do was create something that people would become interested in the general population, and that was a story. And the story was that Barry Marshall himself drank down some of that bacteria that caused ulcers. H. pylori bacteria is what it's called. And he drank it down, and he gave himself an ulcer. And then he documented himself using antibiotics to cure that ulcer. And that's a great story, and newspapers picked it up. And that's how the tide turned in the early 90s, and people began to believe that ulcers were not caused by stress or by your mother giving you candy when you would cry as a baby, but indeed they were caused by bacterial infections. Now, stress can obviously exacerbate symptoms, which leads to a lot of confusion in the medical industry. But indeed, the source of ulcers, 85% of the time, is a bacterial infection, and that's a biological source. So, Morgellons disease has a similar trajectory, right? So, what is it? Morgellons disease has all of the symptoms of chronic Lyme disease: the fatigue, the brain fog, the migratory joint and muscle pain, and what Morgellons disease has that is above and beyond chronic Lyme disease are lesions that appear on skin, and the defining characteristic of Morgellons disease, which is fibers growing out of the skin. Now, that's a really bizarre symptom and confounding symptom and frightening symptom. And it's a physical symptom. So, when I began looking into the disease, I thought, well, this is emblematic. This is sort of the epitome of medical denialism, if this is true, if this is a real disease, because people will say they have physical evidence of a disease, and doctors say, no, that's all in your head, or that fiber isn't the fiber you think it is, or I'm not going to look at your skin because if I were to examine you, it would then confirm your delusion that you have something and I know you don't, so I won't even bother going into that. Now, the term Morgellons disease comes from the microbiologist Mary Lytow, who found fibers in her son's skin in the early 2000s. And she went back into medical history and found kind of a similar disease that was unexplained that happened in the Morgellons region of France. And so she took that as kind of a placeholder until there was a better term that would describe what was happening to these patients who were getting filaments coming out of unbroken skin and all of the other sort of chronic Lyme disease symptoms. Now, when you go online and you might search for Morgellons disease, one of the things you'll find is that there's a lot of different definitions in the ether about what Morgellons disease is, even though the official definition is all of the symptoms of chronic Lyme disease plus lesions and filaments coming out of unbroken skin. And so these different definitions where folks will say, Morgellons is a parasite or it's nanotechnology that the government is raining down from chemtrails into your skin to control your mind. A lot of these things, they serve to confuse folks and to excite folks' imagination and to kind of pull focus away from what the problem is, that it appears to be a bacterial infection that is a real disease causing real filaments to come out of the skin. So these filaments, that's also another point of controversy. It's like, what are they made of? Are they cellulose? Are they just textile filaments? Are they from a carpet? Are they from a shirt? What are these filaments from? And so there's been research done by the Charles E. Holman Foundation and independent scientists, microbiologists, and they found that the filaments are made of proteins, so collagen and keratin. So that indicates that they're produced by the body. And so there's a lot of evidence, just as there were for ulcers being bacterial infections, that Morgellons disease has a biological source. And it's the perception of Morgellons disease as something that's all in folks' head that makes it so difficult for people to get treatment. This has happened time and time again, this kind of medical denialism. You have, in the 1950s and 60s, autism, children who have autism, their condition was blamed on what were called refrigerator mothers. I don't know if you're old enough to remember this or if you've researched this, but the thought was in the medical industry that these mothers were just so cold and unfeeling and disconnected from their children that they created in these kids this condition, this autistic condition. And what you see in that is just kind of a pattern of victim blaming. It's like, oh, we as doctors don't understand the condition presented to us. It's outside of the medical training that we've received thus far. And therefore, I feel like I'm the authority and I don't have an answer and I'm confounded. You are the problem. You are the problem. And this chronic Lyme disease that I don't understand, I'm saying it's not real. This autism is your fault because you must have created this in your child. Or this, this set of symptoms that I'm seeing before me must be you over complaining, right? So one book that I will recommend if you're interested more is called Doing Harm. It's by Maya Dusenberry. And I'm going to read you a quote from that book. There is a stark imbalance in the burden of proof needed to make a psychogenic diagnosis versus an organic one. To attribute a symptom to a physical disease, observable evidence of pathology is required. To label it psychogenic, all you need, indeed, since there's no test for psychogenesis, the best you'll ever have is a strong suspicion. So that is the crux of the disbelief problem, the medical denialism problem, is that, to diagnose a disease, you need a test that tests positive. To figure out to say something is a somatoform disorder or is conversion disorder. You just kind of need to intuit it, and a lot of times prejudice will get doctors to intuit the wrong way. So one of the doctors that I found in the world that participated in the documentary as a dermatologist who has a real difficult time empathizing with people. He's not a people person. He told me many times that he got into science because he scored well. He got into medicine because he scored well on the SATs, not because he's a people person. But he found as he started to see patients that he needed to have empathy for them to give him good scores and to have his online rating rank higher. So he kind of created a persona of empathy. He doesn't have real empathy, but he has this kind of shtick that he does that is great for 5 or 10 or 15-minute consultations with somebody who's got psoriasis or a pretty common skin disease or condition. So he kind of does the same scripted dialogue every time he sees a patient. And if you see the film Skin Deep, you'll see the scene where we follow him through various patients, and he has the same kind of seemingly fun and spontaneous dialogue, but it's actually scripted. And he talks about this and how you can create a persona of empathy. But what happens in the film when he goes to the Morgellons Disease Conference is that his empathy is tested because there's a room full of folks who are frustrated with the medical mistreatment and the medical industry denying their reality of having Morgellons disease. And he's very tone deaf to their sensitivity around this. And he starts making jokes that go over very poorly. And then the whole room gets very angry at him. And it's this kind of blow up. And it stands as a proxy for the disconnect between the medical industry and the patient community that feels abused by the medical industry. And I highly recommend you check out the film if you want to learn about Morgellons disease and you want to see it dramatized, not just in this doctor who, will be like perhaps some of the doctors in your experience as a chronic Lyme disease patient or a Lyme disease advocate, as far as the frustrating aspect of medicine. But there's also someone we follow named Cindy Casey. Now, the way I got involved in and started to film with the Morgellons disease community is that once I started zeroing in on the subject of Morgellons disease, I reached out to Cindy Casey, who is the head of the Charles E. Holman Morgellons Disease Foundation, whose website is morgellonsdisease.org, and I started talking to her, and we, after a few conversations, decided that it would be a wise idea for me to come with some cameras and film at the annual Morgellons Disease Conference in Austin, Texas. And so I did that. I did that 4 years in a row. And I tell Cindy's story in the documentary. And Cindy's story is one of a registered nurse in the 90s who gets these symptoms. And they come back in the early 2000s. And she is not, even though she's in the medical industry, she can't get the help that she needs to get a correct diagnosis. And doctors start to blame her and to diagnose her with psychosomatic illness, to say that it's all in her head and that she's self-harming, she's picking at herself, and the lesions are actually her causing, not that the lesions are appearing because of a disease, that she's picking at herself, and that's the reason. So, you can imagine how she felt, and she was pretty frustrated, and she met a guy who became her advocate named Charles Holman, and they got married, and he became her big advocate. He became her big support. Tragically, Charles passed away, and it leaves Cindy as sort of thrust into the leadership of this movement that Charles had created to get Morgellons disease recognized by the medical community and the general public at large. And so Cindy's story, it's heartbreaking, but it's also inspiring to see her rise to the occasion and to lead a march at the Texas State Capitol along with the Texas Lyme Disease Association, which are big supporters of the Morgellons disease movement, and to see that coalition form was really inspiring. Just as somebody, as a filmmaker watching, just to see how two communities can come together and really create something powerful. And that's, you know, one of the big things I want to talk about is the importance of activism and the importance of allies. Forming allies is one of the most important things you can do as a small organization, to find others who've been in similar positions and who can hear the situation and understand the situation that you're in, and to align together. It creates a lot of power and a lot of opportunity to band together. I mean, there's power in numbers. That's a cliche because it's true. And I highly recommend for individuals to join together to create organizations, and for small organizations to partner up with larger organizations. I saw that work in the Morgellons disease community, and I highly recommend it. Now, what do we do in the time of coronavirus? That's the big question, right? Well, it's all online, basically. If we're not able to gather in large groups, and here we are, you know, having a march online, the information has to become the activism. So with Morgellons disease, like I mentioned earlier, the big problem is that the perception of it is one of generally of disbelief. Now, things have been changing over the past 5 years, and I hope that the film itself, Skin Deep, will change people's minds, but still there's a lot of work to be done. I look around the internet and there's still tons of work to be done, and there's a perception that needs to be changed. So how does that happen? Well, social media is great, talking about Morgellons disease, talking about morgellonsdisease.org or the Charles E. Holman Foundation, the film itself, talking about the documentary. But more than that, it's really about individuals blogging. So the authority of a website is dependent upon a few things on the internet, and when an individual types in Morgellons disease to see what it's about, you know, Google will spit out a search engine results page, and the ranking of the websites are what people are going to look at. They're going to look at the first page first, the second page second. Maybe they don't even make it to the third or fourth page. And so it's important to have the authority of your website, whether it's morgellonsdisease.org or whether it's the website for my film, morgellonsmovie.org, or a site that you believe in. It's important that that has authority so that it gets ranked. So how does something get authority? Well, it's really about what sites talk about that website, what other sites talk about that website. So if you want to engage in activism for Morgellons disease, you need to write blogs. This is my recommendation. This is what I'm trying to tell you. Blogs, they don't have to be long. They can be 7 things you didn't know about Morgellons disease, or 3 reasons why Morgellons disease is real. You know, some of these kind of standard things that you see, the structure of blogging that you see are lists generally around the internet nowadays, and you take that format and then you research and explain Morgellons disease as it should be explained, not as a conspiracy theory, not as a psychosomatic illness that everyone's faking, but as a bacterial infection that's causing protein-based fibers and filaments to come out of unbroken skin on individuals, plus all the symptoms of chronic Lyme disease. So when blogging, one of the important things to do, inside the blog itself, you know, whether it's going to be on Medium or that blog will be on WordPress, there's an important thing to do, which is to find 2 keywords, right? Morgellons disease, conspiracy, Morgellons filaments, one of these popular terms, you know, keywords, usually 2 words together, and to create a hyperlink of those 2 words, and then to make that hyperlink point to, say, morgellonsmovie.org or morgellonsdisease.org, or if you have another site that you want to promote, that you want the authority to increase on the search engine results page, to link that hyperlink to that page. This is key. This is very technical. This is very specific. I understand. This is not marching in the streets with a sign, which is great in normal times, but we're not in those times. This is very specific. Blog, find a keyword, Morgellons disease, Morgellons conspiracy, Morgellons filaments, whatever you're typing about, make sure there's keywords in there. Hyperlink, point to a website that you want to increase the authority of. Because in the end, the search engine results page, Google results, are going to inform people of what Morgellons disease is, and you want the website that promotes the science and the correct definition of Morgellons disease to be on that first or second page, because otherwise that information will never get there. We'll never have that story that reaches across the oceans and to the general public, like Barry Marshall's story about how ulcers were created by bacterial infections. So we need to band together and blog and link key terms with a hyperlink to a website. So that's my specific activism for you. So thank you very much for listening to me today. Again, I'm Ware, the director of Skin Deep, the Battle Over Morgellons. Morgellons disease is an important issue for chronic Lyme disease patients and advocates, because 6% of all chronic Lyme disease patients get the symptoms of Morgellons disease. It's something you can learn about by watching my film at morgellonsmovie.org. That's MORGELLONS movie.org. You can find out more of the science and patient advocacy at morgellonsdisease.org. And you can, once you're educated, I really recommend you blog about Morgellons disease and use keywords to hyperlink to websites such as the ones I just mentioned to increase their authority within the public. So thank you. God bless you. May your health improve. May your loved ones stay safe during these times. And may activism unite us and keep us moving forward and progressing and making the medical industry and the world in general a better place. Thanks. Bye.